Good evening, comrades and friends. My talk tonight is on the shadow of NATO and the breakup of Yugoslavia as a lesson for today. NATO was a military alliance of the imperialist countries led by the United States. Started in 1949 with 12 members, NATO has expanded to 29 countries, the most recent ones being the former Eastern European socialist countries. NATO is the military wing of imperialism, dedicated to spreading capitalist neoliberal policies, the so-called free market, the privatization of state property, the destruction of social services, and the shift to policies of immiseration for the workers of the world, and war. NATO was supposed to be a defensive organization, a Cold War alliance against the so-called Soviet threat in the early years of the Cold War. When the USSR was destroyed, the United States and NATO promised not to expand NATO into the former socialist countries in Eastern Europe. They lied. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Workers' World explained that U.S. imperialism would use this as an opportunity to reconquer the countries that achieved any level of independence. Almost alone in the U.S., Workers' World showed that it was the United States' plan to expand NATO into Eastern Europe and the Balkans. The U.S. was the power behind the enforced breakup of Yugoslavia. Initiated in 1990, just as Germany was reuniting. With the collapse of the USSR, U.S. Foreign Appropriations Funding Bill of 1991, signed originally in November of 1990, ordered the breakup of Yugoslavia. 6 independent, so-called, republics, but they were not to be independent. They would be U.S. NATO satellites. There was a short political struggle between Germany and the United States, which was resolved in favor of the United States by the Dayton Accords. NATO was to stay as a force of occupation in Germany and expand into Eastern Europe and would control the Balkans. It was clear to many that this was the beginning of what a British diplomat called getting NATO's foot in the door and expanding NATO East, out of area. That's how they called it. Germany worked in Croatia, creating a right-wing separatist government. Croatia was run by the Nazi Ustasha in World War II, and the progeny of those leaders who had been protected and hidden by the Vatican, the German, the United States, and Canadian governments at the end of the war became the leaders of Croatia. Slovenia was Germanized too. Croatian President Franco Tuđman said, "I've been blessed by the fact that my wife is neither a Serb nor Jewish," and he vowed to remove the Serbs who had lived in that region for 600 years. With the assistance of NATO in 1995 and Operation Storm, 250,000 Serbs were ethnically cleansed from Krajina in Croatia. Last year, one of my students said that she was a baby in her parents' arms fleeing the Krajina. Her grandparents and many of their neighbors were killed in that operation. In 1992, the United States had led the NATO war into Bosnia on the side of the Bosnian Muslims under Alija Izetbegovic, a man who wrote he favored, quote, an Islamic republic with Islamic laws in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and who declared he wanted to, quote, eliminate Serbs in Bosnia. The U.S. NATO presented the war in Bosnia, which lasted from 1992 until 1995, as the fault of the Yugoslav government. Through the lies circulated by United States and European NATO leaders and the international bourgeois press, the Serbs of Yugoslavia became the villains of the war. NATO leaders and their paid spokesmen claimed that Serbs were committing massacres, while the press ignored Bosnian Muslim forces armed, trained, and financed by the United States, who obliterated 150 villages, murdered 2,383 Serb women and children and elders in the Serbian regions of Bosnia. The Yugoslav government was defending the sovereignty of Bosnia, one of its republics. When the capitalist press and NATO manufactured what they called the genocide of 8,000 Bosnians in Herzegovina, the graves found in that region were found to contained less than 1,500 bodies, and they were of the soldiers from the Bosnian army themselves. Western NGOs and the press reported 20,000 Serbian army rapes of Bosnian women. These reports were countered by Helsinki Watch, Human Rights Watch, and Simone Weil, who was the president of the European Parliament at the time. But that truth never saw the light of day. Radovan Karadzic, the president of Republika Srpska, that's the Serb region inside of Bosnia, was just sentenced to 40 years for genocide. That genocide. The International Court Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, it's called ICTY, the NATO bought and paid for court, sentenced Karadzic on entirely fabricated evidence. His verdict was delivered on March 24th. March 24th marked the 17th year anniversary of the start of NATO's 78-day bombing of Yugoslavia. To take the final steps to completely break up Yugoslavia, NATO had manufactured another false genocide story, this time in the region of Kosovo, and proceeded to bomb that region with depleted uranium, forcing thousands to flee. By the way, cancer rates now in Kosovo are up by 25% since then. The flight of innocents running from the bombs was blamed on Yugoslavian President Slobodan Milosevic and the Yugoslav army. In the ensuing horror, the man who had headed up Operation Storm, which had ethnically cleansed 250,000 Serbs from the Krajina and Croatia, Hasim Thaci, organized the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army. That's a group of thug terrorists, they're still around, and Wahhabi fundamentalist head cutters and organ traders who are currently in power in Kosovo. Thaci is the elected president of Kosovo, the center of the world's heroin trade. The truth about Yugoslavia is coming out. The U.S. NATO template for regime change and war began in Yugoslavia. Breaking up and destabilization of a sovereign nation, demonizing leaders and the people such that people living in the NATO countries supported the bombing and mass murder of the people living there, creating false flag stories to make the leaders of and the armies of the targeted nations appear to be brutal and subhuman. In the case of Yugoslavia, the Serbs were blamed for a siege of Sarajevo and murders of people in the Markala marketplace, which even some of the Western press and the UN believed were committed by the Bosnian government. NATO attacked and destroyed civilian targets in Yugoslavia. 6,000 Serbs were killed. NATO bombed 25,000 housing units, 14 airports, 20 health centers, 18 kindergartens, 69 schools, 38 bridges. There were 2,300 NATO airstrikes, 420,000 missiles launched. A third of the power capacity of Yugoslavia was obliterated. They dropped 3,700 cluster bombs, destroyed factories and oil refineries, and NATO for the first time used graphite bombs to disable Yugoslavia's power system. NATO war's pundits made heroes of Bosnia and Kosovo terrorist armies, including fundamentalist Mujahideen, who had been part of the CIA war against Afghanistan in the 70s and have of late been linked to ISIS. When the war was over, the U.S. conducted its first color revolution and created a coup, the bulldozer revolution, which placed pro-U.S. NATO neoliberal odd-poor leaders, George Soros ideologues, every one, in power in Belgrade. Then NATO kidnapped President Milosevic and placed him in prison in The Hague, creating their phony ICTY International Court Tribunal for Yugoslavia. Milosevic was sick and feared he was being poisoned. He died in a NATO prison, which had not been used since the Nazis held prisoners there in World War II that NATO took over. Imperialist wars are always called moral. Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and Jean Chrétien declared the aggression against Serbia was a moral imperative, that's their words, to bring, again their words, peace and stability to the region. But no, it was NATO's first foray into an out-of-area post-Cold War aggression against a sovereign state. They call this war humanitarian intervention. During the 78 U.S. NATO bombing of Yugoslavia's the International Action Center, this organization, organized at great risk two solidarity and fact-finding delegations under the bombing was happening, with Ramsey Clark. We organized delegations after the war to expose U.S. NATO war crimes and held an international war crimes tribunal. We went to The Hague, and Ramsey Clark visited President Milosevic after NATO captured him and put him on trial in their kangaroo court. The IAC provided President Milosevic with information to help him in his war crimes trial. Workers' World activists and the IAC consistently opposed the breakup of Yugoslavia and the U.S.-NATO war, the vicious imperialist aggression against a prosperous, multi-ethnic, peaceful country. We spent more than a decade educating and mobilizing against the danger of NATO expansion. Years and years we did this, while others were accepting that humanitarian intervention fairy tale that ideologically and materially destroyed Yugoslavia, the last independent socialist nation of Eastern Europe. Workers' World IAC organized major forums, educationals, coalitions, and international petitions, teach-ins, demonstrations. We went to Washington. We were in the streets of New York, Chicago. We met with people from Canada. Our articles that we published in the Workers' World newspaper and in our books such as NATO in the Balkans were translated into many languages. You can find them online. We had articles explaining the imperial policy that's showing that the wars in Yugoslavia in the early 90s, that the recognition of Croatia and Bosnia and Serbian expulsion from Ukraine were designed to consolidate United States NATO expansionism. When Serbia remained intransigent, then all-out war and the merciless bombing of Yugoslavia began in 1999. But few people knew this. The imperialist press promoted lies, and Yugoslavia became a test of a new form of imperialism, which included propaganda. This was what the United States did in Iraq, in Libya, what the U.S. allies and satraps like Turkey and Saudi Arabia are trying to achieve in Syria, in Yemen, what is happening with U.S.-Israeli client state Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh against Armenia. Turkey's part of that too. All the NATO wars and expansionism in Europe, in Eurasia, and Africa began in Yugoslavia. But 25 years after this began, things are changing. Last December, the Montenegrin government, in contravention to the wishes of its people, of this NATO-created nation, decided that Montenegro would join NATO. Thousands of people in the capital city of Podgorica took the streets decrying such perfidy. At the rally, the former Prime Minister of Yugoslavia, Momir Bulatovic, said, "The blood of innocent people is on our hands." Bulatovic showed how people of ex-Yugoslavia understood how the shadow of NATO expansion and war began and what it meant. He said, "What has Afghanistan done wrong? What has Iraq done wrong? Why has Libya been destroyed? What's happening in Syria?" Serbian puppet government Prime Minister Alexander Vučić has long been working in the interests of the United States, British, and the German bourgeoisie, selling off state property, cutting social services, and Serbian President Tomislav Nikolic on February 19th of this year signed an agreement with NATO which allows free passage of NATO troops through Serbia and makes every NATO soldier exempt from punishment for any crime or misdemeanor in Serbia. They have the right to enter any establishment. The next day, February 20th, more than 15,000 people poured into the streets of Belgrade, furious that the murderous army of the invader was free to occupy Serbia and violate its people. On March 19th, in Novi Sad, Serbia's second largest city, thousands took to the streets to protest the Comprador government's complicity with NATO. On Sunday, March 27th, 20,000 people took over the central square of Belgrade, denouncing Serbia's collaboration with NATO, and many carried pictures of Vladimir Putin, with some signs calling for Russia's assistance in Serbia. An internationalist, anti-imperialist, anti-NATO movement is growing now, and all the truths are coming out. Just a few things about Yugoslavia and why did Yugoslavia get chosen to be destroyed. It was the last socialist government of Europe. That was the very last one. It was the one, as Comrade pointed out, that helped organize. It was first organized, the non-aligned movement was organized by Tito out of Yugoslavia, and it was the only thing that was really confronting the situation of the problems of the third world. In fact, that very expression came from, the defenders of for people from the non-aligned movement. Somebody said something about people being friends of the United States. Actually, Yugoslavia was kind of a friend of the United States. Yugoslavia was sort of like a special, sort of NATO-ish sort of pal for a while, because that's what the United States needed it to be until the other real socialist countries were destroyed, and then after that, the United States turned on Yugoslavia. And I want to reiterate something that Sarah said, and that is that one of the methods which is now in process that the United States is endlessly trying to do is divide people up by religion or by group. And in Yugoslavia, that's what happened when they brought in the Croatians or the Slovenian or the Bosnian or Kosovo peoples, or the saying Serbs are bad or they hate the Montenegrins or the Macedonians or whatever. All of that was done with the purpose of getting these elements in, so that not everybody felt that way. People were married to Croatians, were married to Serbs, and Montenegrins were married to. I mean, it was a very open place, and nobody was particularly thinking about it except when the United States brought it in, and that's what they are trying to do in Syria, and that's what they're trying to do in Iraq. That's, that was the proving ground for this particular approach. I just want to, there was something I would say about the refugee problem that's going on in Europe, and that is that one of the things the United States, I think, and maybe the NATO countries got from the idea of breaking people up is saying, well, now if more people are flowing into Europe, then people would come in and they'll be at odds with each other, and it'll be harder for Europeans to organize themselves, because the economies of Europe, not just Bosnia and Kosovo, the economies of all of Eastern Europe are in very, very, very bad shape, and there's massive unemployment, and there's, just horrible economic conditions, and all of the former educational systems, healthcare systems, cultural systems. If you wanted to study to be a ballet dancer or a violinist, whatever, it's all free. It was totally free. Now it's not. When I went for the IAC to Belgrade, the woman whose house I was staying, the neighbor of our friend Milos, the neighbor was very upset as she was watching television. She was saying, they're closing the hospital where she was sitting there with her two children, where these two children were born. They're privatizing this hospital, and they're closing the maternity section. So that thing is happening. I'm going to go again to Belgrade, and I'm also going to Montenegro this summer. And this is an answer to Sue's question, because I became friends with some people in Yugoslavia it was Serbia, when I was there, and then I kept in touch with him through email, and then some of you may know I'm a bit of a Facebook fiend, and so, I live far away with people who aren't comrades, so my comrades are online, So I became friends with a lot of former Yugoslavs who had really wonderful viewpoints, and we exchanged information, and we're friends. I'm staying at somebody's house who invited me there. She's friend with another friend of Sarah knows her, Radmila, other people who are, the fellow who came here, if you remember from the IAC, came here, Vladimir Krasnyan, all these people, and they are so excited that things are happening. Actually, before that February decision, the the people were writing and saying, this is really terrible, it's really awful, the people are so quiet, the people are just falling apart because they're so unhappy. And now, the letters and the things that they're putting in, and this is something I would recommend, there's something called Balkan News Network, and you can become a member of it if you're on Facebook. And they have, yes, a lot of things in Serbian, but they also have things that they're translated to English, so that you can read what's really going on. And I follow it like literally every day, because, you know, I was also sad for them, but I said, I'm sure something's going to change. I'm sure something's going to change. And then when it began to change, I said, I told you so. Because I knew you can't, you know, oppression breeds resistance. It always, always does. And it's happening there. And I actually believe, because I saw the other day that in Romania, young people were polled, and they all said that they'd rather live under communism. Not just the old people saying, oh, I wish it was the way it used to be. But young people are saying, I'm sure it was better then, and that's what I want to live under. So that's what's happening.